We may have finished the mainline books, but we're not done yet. In case it wasn't clear from the first short stories collection video, the cut content adds a ton to both the world and characters, while also recontextualizing a lot of the scenes we do see in the main story. The first one brought a lot to part 3, but can it keep up that momentum? Yeah, it does. Spoiler. But before I go ahead and get into this, just remember this covers content from part 2 all the way up to part 5 volume 4. So please just keep the spoilers for the back half of part 5 to yourselves in the comments. I don't want to have to go deleting them. It's kinda rude for others. Though I do understand that's kinda rich coming from me, considering I just released part 5 volume 12. And clearly Bookworm's not done on this channel, so why not hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on content from me. I also have merch for sale, so you can check that out as well. Pick up some of your favorite Bookworm designs. And with those obligatory plugs out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the second short stories collection. First up is meeting the attendants from Effa's perspective. This is an unpublished short story from around the start of part 2, where Effa meets Gil and Fran for the first time. It's exploring her thoughts on these weird people showing up out of the blue. Mine and Lutz come home from the temple, but when Effa sees them by the well, she's thrown off by the two people standing next to Mine looking out of place due to their mannerisms and clothes. They don't fit in. She assumes they're from the wealthy part of town, or maybe from the Gilberta Company, escorting Mine home after she did something stupid again. But no, Lutz speaks up in Mine's defense, being the only person there that Effa trusts at all. So who are these strangers? Lutz is there to introduce them, since he'll be busy and they'll be dropping Mine off after work. Cool, but that whole temple thing is kind of on the down low, so they head up to their house to go discuss it. Gil is curious, but Fran looks visibly uncomfortable. Effa just assumes it's because their house is dirty, but Mine doesn't even notice the tense atmosphere as she introduces them as her temple attendants. They give a greeting and kneel, throwing Effa off as she pulls Mine in behind her. Yeah, it's a pretty weird gesture, and Effa doesn't have a great opinion of the temple in the first place after what Beze once pulled, so she's kind of on edge. Plus, their clothes are kinda nice and they're getting dirty on their floor, but Lutz assures her they're good people, and explains he'll be too busy with work to take Mine home every day. Yeah, he's always going above and beyond for their daughter, but Lutz isn't just doing this for Mine. It benefits Benno as well. As for Fran and Gil, they're just gonna pass them off as Gilberta Company employees to the lower city, so no one figures out that Mine is working at the temple. Yeah, Effa realizes after seeing the sheer amount of money changing hands when Mine negotiated with Karina, but her inventions are worth a ton, which makes her a target. Best keep her as hidden from the public eye as possible, thus she entrusts her daughter to Gil and Fran, which makes Fran brighten up a bit. Yeah, turns out he wasn't disgusted by their house, he was worried about her accepting them as her daughter's attendants. I guess she just learned not to judge a book by its cover. Not that she's seen many books in her life, or can even read at this point. This seems like an odd story to kick this book off with, as it's not super important to any of the characters or world, and I definitely see why it wasn't included in the final books themselves. But I will say, it does give us a few pieces of information that show how Mine's family saw her temple attendance, and also clues us in that Effa is still wary of the temple, especially after that incident she was involved with. The fact the High Priest is keeping his promise to them at least leaves her with a positive impression. So if there's anything to be gained from these few short pages, it's just a bit of background on Effa's thoughts after things settled from part 1. Next is Change Begins from Rico's perspective. So, who's Rico? One of the orphans suffering in the basement in part 2, volume 1. What I like is, this kid has apparently always had a name, showing he's someone the author has actively thought about when writing for the orphanage, but it never really comes up in the mainline story because, well, Mine would never really have a reason to interact with him. This was in an online short stories collection and never got published because it's pretty dark for this point in the story. However, Rico does appear in a short story at the end of part 2, volume 3's manga, so he's not entirely unheard of. Life for the orphanage kids pretty much sucks. Like, they don't have beds or anything to do and basically just live in excrement. Absolutely gross. Rico's super hot because it's summer and his only entertainment is watching the sun move across the floor. Yeah, there's nothing to do, but even if there was, he's too hungry to move and that just wastes energy. So no one there is really doing anything at all besides just kind of waiting for their divine gifts. But he does know that food should be coming soon based on the position of the sun. He has faint memories when the orphanage used to be in better shape. There were older women there who raised the kids communally, and they all just kind of played pretty much all day. Sounds great, but those are distant memories now. and he barely recalls them at all. That's when the door opens and we learn what the daily routine was like back then. Shrine Maidens came, opened the windows to the orphanage, changed the chamber pot, took the dirty bowls away, threw down some breakfast, brought fresh water, and left. They then brought new bowls at noon and, at night, gave them dinner with some more water. That was the extent of their duties, and they did it as quickly as possible. So who's on duty today? Rosina, who's pissed that she's even having to do this. The doors open and they basically drop the food on the table and run. The biggest kids are closest to the door so they can eat, while the smaller and weaker ones are pushed to the back where they have their food stolen. Rico climbs up onto a table for that very thing to almost happen to him, but instead his bowl gets knocked out of his hands and lands on the ground. That's where his soup-soaked bread flies out, and he dives to catch it and shove it in his mouth before anyone can steal it. Covered in dirt or not, it's still food, and he's happy to have it. But that is a fleeting joy. Well, time to just wait around until the next meal. That's when another door opens up behind Rico, one he pretty much forgot about because it's been closed for so long. And this happens to be when Mine first learns about the orphanage's sad state. Rico only cares about something sweet that landed next to him and shoves it into his mouth, remarking how soft that bread was after Mine gets carried away by Gil after fainting. Later that night, Gil returns with more bread and soup for all the kids. He tells them that they need to regain their energy before they can wash them and get them outside. As he scolds them to eat with their spoons, one kid remarks that a woman named Maddie used to say that too. And Gil smiles because Maddie actually took care of him when he was down there. But Rico doesn't remember her at all. After the kids eat, Gil says he'll be back tomorrow and tells them good night, which is strange. No one said that for a long time. Rico actually smiles for the first time in a while that he can remember. All of the kids are abuzz with the promise of more food tomorrow, and the fact that someone actually said goodnight to them. Yeah, in typical bookworm fashion, this story being too dark isn't because it's bloody or gory, it's because it's just depressing. We've known that the orphanage was in a sad state, and Mine even compares the children there to the emaciated images of African children seen in commercials and online. But here, we get all of that firsthand. The literal quiet desperation of someone starving to death as they wait for food. They don't care if it's covered in dirt, they can't even move. They're just looking forward to their next meal, hoping they can keep going. But what makes this hit home is after they've eaten their fill, what actually makes Rico cry at the end of the story was being treated like a human. Something the Shrine Maidens hadn't done for these kids in the basement. Hope and a good night was all it took. And that's really sad, and also effective. I see why this wasn't included because honestly, it's kinda redundant, but even in something that's extra to the story, there's a lot of attention to emotional payoff. I think that's why this one stood out and was worth including in this short stories collection. Next is debuting Dies with Lady Rosemine from Brunhilde's perspective, taking place in Part 4, Volume 5, where we see the dying contest through an average archnoble's eyes, and just how badly Rosemine was screwing up at socializing. We get a quick summary of why Brunhilde chose to serve Rosemine, but none of that is new information. We do see that she proposed working commoners around the clock to supply their new trends at the academy as soon as possible. Rosemine shot that down, but this is before Brunhilde learned the value of commoners, so she really didn't see why until Rosemine reframes it as giving Brunhilde more work on a whim as an example. And that made it click somewhat. She doesn't see what that has to do with commoners though, because she's only ever had to just order them around. They figure it out from there, so Rosemine's logic was a source of confusion. Hell, when they went to Groschel, Rosemine visited the lower city and instructed the craftspeople in person. We do get a bit of a peek behind the curtain, that Hartmut and Felina were against going, but they still went anyway. Brunhilde only went at Rosemine's insistence, never by choice. Obviously, it was gross as hell there, and the commoners were off-putting, but after seeing how Rosemine and the Gutenbergs worked together firsthand, she realized they had a better working relationship than Rosemine does with her noble retainers. And after speaking to Hartmut, she realizes her temple retainers have a similar level of trust. Her noble retainers are gonna have to compromise to earn that. He assumes it'll most likely just take time on their part, but that said, he also realizes that Ehrenfest will develop with Rosemine at its center. Now Brunhilde's interest is piqued in the temple, and upon seeing it, she was impressed. But after hearing Rosemine boast about Fran's training, she wonders if she would get the same praise from her lady too. We cut over to the dyeing competition now, and we get a completely different take from what Rosemine described. To her, she was more focused on finding Effa's cloth, but for Brunhilde, it was all about the new trends. And the event was a goddamn mess. First, the format was unheard of and she obviously takes issue with it, but the logistics of the debut and nature of picking their own cloth, means it really can't be helped. Besides, remember, Hartmut said she needs to compromise, so Brunhilde's trying to meet her halfway, and thus focuses on trying to make the new event go as smoothly as possible. That's when Elvira and Aurelia show up, and Brunhilde isn't too happy to see she's wearing her veil still despite all the protests, because it's very clearly showing her allegiance to Arnsbach. Why the hell is she being so stubborn when people are asking her to take it off? But Rosemine throws a curveball out and suggests a new cloth entirely. Okay, we thought that was a pretty novel idea, but that's actually incredibly rude. Because she's Ob Arnsbach's niece from a greater duchy, suggesting she use cloth from a middle duchy is just backwards. Most nobles would just straight up take that as an insult, but with Elvira saying it would change people's impressions about her, Aurelia accepts it with zero pushback. Yeah, that threw Brunhilde for a loop. Judging this situation, Aurelia wasn't treating Rosemine with any hostility, and Elvira paired her with her own attendant, so she was clearly being kept under a tight leash. Brunhilde listened to their chatter, and at times she was bewildered, and others she fought the urge to burst out into laughter. When Aurelia's embroidered veil came up, that would normally be investigated for posing a threat, but Rosemine just thought it was kinda neat. What the hell? Does this girl have zero survival instincts? How many times has her life come under threat? And then Rosemine offering to buy the new cloth for Aurelia's veil is stepping onto her husband's territory, showing us that Rosemine was a Yuri magnet this entire series. At the end of the event, Rosemine's sad and just picks up his cloth by accident, and we see Brunhilde was incredibly critical of the skills used in its creation. Was it actually bad, or is Brunhilde just not used to this method? Hard to say. Or not. Later, she flat out admits she doesn't see how it would translate into clothing. But if it's what Rosemine wants, it's what she gets. At the tea party portion, Brunhilde is again hit with Rosemine's eccentricities. Not only did she focus on the food and swap stories, but she didn't even try to promote her new cloth or gather information on Arnsbach like she was supposed to. That's when she catches some people talking poorly about the dye and immediately defends her lady by promoting it, which actually prompts an older noble to remark how it's like the cloth her mother used to wear. And that's kinda the point, to broaden fashion with a number of dyeing methods. That gets Brunhilde into the zone to promote the cloth as developing a new trend together with the Archducal family. At the end, when deciding who gets the title, Rosemine leaves picking the cloth for her winter outfit to Brunhilde, and that fills her with joy for finally meeting her lady's expectations. Yeah, this is still in the adjustment period where Brunhilde is getting accustomed to serving Rosemine, but what Rosemine missed throughout that entire part of the story was just how much her new retainers were struggling to keep up with her, and we're getting firsthand how abnormal her perspective is to a thoroughbred noble like Brunhilde. This packs a ton of information that would have helped us understand a lot of the disconnect between Rosemine and her retainers. This is still that awkward phase where Rosemine's not really paying attention to politics, so seeing that play out behind the scenes might have put an otherwise fun event into perspective. But while I wish this was included in the volume, there was stiff competition between Felina's side story paying off Matthias' prologue, Aurelia's side story showcasing her time in Ehrenfest, and Neffa's efforts leading up to the competition. There just wasn't room, so I see why this didn't make the cut. We're sticking with Brunhilde's perspective for as the daughter of Guy Groschel. This is basically Brunhilde's side of the story after hearing the printing industry would fail if they didn't make changes, but she's still struggling to see Rosemine's point of view, obviously. So she speaks to Elvira and Hartmut about it because they both have different perspectives from her, as a girl raised to be a Gibbs heir. We pick up with her getting Rosemine's chambers ready at the estate where Bertilda comes to chat for a bit. Oh hey, here's a character I wanted to see more of in the main story. She is a lot like Brunhilde, but also a bit more precocious. Though it's taken me until reading this to remember that she has pink and not red hair. That always throws me off for some reason. She's looking for stories about the Royal Academy to gain a leg up in the playroom over her peers. However, her forwardness isn't a good thing in noble society, and Brunhilde reminds her of just that. But here is where we learn that Elvira is training Bertilda as an attendant to serve Rosemine when she starts at the academy. Under Brunhilde's suggestion, of course, she did the introductions. So they chat some more, where Brunhilde, being Rosemine's retainer, has afforded their province some insights into the noble quarter they wouldn't normally get. But after the room is prepared, her mother swings by to request a moment of her time before she goes back to serving her lady. And what seems to be the issue exactly? Well, in private, her mother explains that the Gieb's second wife is pregnant. If the child is a boy, he's gonna be raised as the next Gieb over Brunhilde. Yeah, that's some pretty troubling news, and this puts her mother's future in jeopardy as well. It's still too early to stress about that though, right? I mean, who knows if it will be a boy, or even survive? None of those are guarantees in this world. Oh, You're watching this after reading Part 5, Volume 4? Yeah, this was a problem back before Rosemine's second year in the academy even started. But you know, doesn't Brunhilde have like a ton of feats to her name? What's a Y chromosome got on her? However, if this is just about securing Rosemine's support because she's the future first wife, why not just marry Hartmut? Barf. Yeah, strictly speaking, on the surface only, he's a pretty good marriage partner, but Brunhilde knows what he's really like, and death sounds like a better choice than spending the rest of her life with that. Also, there's zero chance that he's gonna leave Rosemine's service to support a future Gieb. Yeah, it's a non-starter. She would have better luck looking for a groom outside their duchy, assuming Lai's gang doesn't ostracize them, and thus Brunhilde vows to make sure her mother isn't mistreated in her own home. Smash cut to after dinner, where Rosemine hit them with the news that printing is on the verge of failing in Groschel, despite what all their scholars say, and Brunhilde hears it from her lady in depth later that night, though she still doesn't understand why. But after saying goodnight to Rosemine, Hartmut is waiting outside and invites her to chat. Yeah, she's in no mood to play matchmaker that night, so no thanks. But that's not what he's there about. He knows she can't grasp Rosemine's logic about printing failing there in Groschel, and is trying to set her up for a conversation with Elvira. That way they can talk it over. On the way, he explains how much Rosemine values the Gutenbergs, and he's made the same mistake that Brunhilde did. Basically, don't lump them in with the rest of the commoners. Yeah, she actually started crushing Hartmut a bit in that meeting where she rebuked him, and creepy thing is, dude kinda loved it. Gross. But he does lay out that normal noble logic won't apply to Rosemine. Because she's so used to the temple, she's advancing things in a way that makes sense to her worldview. When they meet with Elvira, she confirms that Groschel couldn't be more different than her home in Haldenzell where printing succeeded. Their province is laid out entirely differently than the others, where the Gieb has very little contact with their lower city. In fact, it has a lower city. Now Brunhilde's overcome with shame, realizing the fact that Groschel prided itself on the barrier its nobles have with their commoners was literally dooming them to failure currently. The idea of changing their whole perspective is absolutely terrifying, but also necessary. Elvira gives her some encouragement though, saying she's already changed her way of thinking before when she started serving Rosemine in the academy. They can still adapt and make printing a success. It's not yet set in stone. So Brunhilde asks them to accompany her tomorrow after breakfast as she sets her father straight. He's much more likely to listen to two archnoble Lies gangs who oversaw success already. This short story isn't as important as the last one, but it does shed some light on a conversation we didn't see in the main books. Like Rosemine told Brunhilde she needed to change her way of thinking, and Brunhilde was just kinda lost in thought, until the next morning when she apparently talked to her father overnight, and they were gonna make some changes. Cool. It left us, and Rosemine for that matter, with an incredibly wrong perception that she actually reached Brunhilde. No, it actually took Hartmut and Elvira saying that their province is too unique and stuck in Gabrielle's ways to realize they're fucking this up. Casual reminder, Rosemine's an incredibly unreliable narrator, but as for the beginning of this story, I'm a big fan of that, as it not just foreshadows future plot points, it also gives Bertilda some more screen time. Girl needed it. Next is growing healthily from Lutz's perspective. This takes place in Part 4, Volume 5, after Lutz returns from Groschel and touches base with all the people in the lower city. And that's basically why it exists, to see the other side of the cast in a noble-centric section of the story. We pick up right as they touch down after coming back from Groschel. Rosemine heads inside the temple to rest up while the Gutenbergs unpack their shit, but they have to sort out whose is whose to get it back to their respective stores. But before Lutz can return to the Planting Company, he and Gil have stuff to take back to the workshop at the temple. Mine had been stoked to get those Groschel stories, but they don't have plans to sell them just yet, mostly because the book is too thin, but they're gonna store these should they compile them into a bigger volume later on. Pretty smart. In the orphanage, we see Dirk and Conrad have grown, the latter now looking normal from his previously malnourished state. Delia is handling most of the kids, and they all want to go to the forest. But Gil's much too busy for that, which sucks for them, and she tries to get him to reconsider. Luckily, Lutz can go, so he offers to be their guide for tomorrow. Back at the Planting Company, Lutz bumps into Mark and a new Lahane she's never met before. Who could it be? It's Karin. Yeah, my complaint had been that we didn't get to see her too much in the main story at all, and guess what this book delivers in spades? Karin and Benno's relationship. But before she can pry any information from Lutz, Mark shoos him off to go report to Benno. And after that, the two of them head on over to the Gilberta Company to give Renata a copy of their new book as well. Benno's accompanying him because he's supposed to be training her, or more like her parents are just too doting to. But joke's on them, So is Benno. Along the way though, Benno explains Cutting's situation, and everyone just kind of assumes the best out of this, that Klausenberg recognized Benno's skills, but Benno isn't too optimistic. Likely, this is just to gather information, so their plan is to keep her both on a tight leash and at arm's length. In the Gilberta Company, Benno asks what Renata's been learning, and hey, we're reminded that Otto and Karina have a son too, Canute. Enter Tuli, who gets a book too. Why not? But when Lutz asks her if she wants to come and drop off Camille's copy, she can't because she's slammed with work. And with that, Lutz takes his leave to go swing by Gunther and Effa's house. Camille answers, where we hear that he looks a ton like Gunther, except for his eyes, which remind Lutz of mine. He then hands over the book and chats with Effa a bit about the dyeing competition in her workload, but turns out Camille is old enough to go to the forest. So Lutz invites him along for tomorrow's trip. That way he can introduce him to Dirk and Conrad. They also play with the same toys that Camille does, which sounds like the best thing for him, as none of the kids in his neighborhood know about him. As the story goes on, we saw less and less of the lower city people aside from major updates. But this book pretty much gives you everything you wanted to see from the main books, and just didn't on their end. Between Cutting's subplot, Renata's growth and education, and Camille hearing about Dirk and Conrad, there's a lot in this that tie to the main books without feeling like it's completely necessary. So it's a nice additional piece. Except for Cutting, still wanted to see that play out in the main story itself. Not that it really involved Rosmine to begin with, I guess. Next is Duchy and mentor relations from Raimund's perspective. This takes place in Part 4, Volume 6, after Rosmine first learned about Raimund being Hersher's disciple, and the ensuing emotional roller coaster for poor Raimund. During his second year brew lessons, Hersher took over for the usual professor, that being Gundolf, and took note of Raimund's skills. And then after checking his notes, she doesn't hesitate to ask him to become her disciple right there in the middle of class. Dude's troubled by that, considering he's below average in the mana department, and assumes that if he accepted, he would get the brunt of others' jealousy. But Hersher's dead serious. Basically, this was his one chance to make a name for himself when his family doesn't expect shit out of him. So he takes it. In her lab, he gets a crash course on the tools in there, where she advises him not to touch most of them until he has a basic understanding of what they do, as they're meant for combat. Nice going, Ferdinand. But he's drawn to a recording one that's a more advanced version of the tool she uses to project notes during class. Seriously, he's floored by that. This was his first introduction to Ferdinand's genius, and his desire to learn from the eccentric who invented unique tools one after another was born. Over his break from school, he got a ton of assignments from Hersher, but they were all fulfilling in a way that he'd never felt before, and firmly established Raimund is cut from the same cloth as Hersher and Ferdinand. Turns out he wasn't being groomed for that lifestyle. He had it in him all along. Fast forward to his meeting with Rosmine, and we get a completely different perspective. While she left a good enough impression on Raimund as a person, her knights and status terrified him to no end. So he was stressed as hell. But Hersher puts it in perspective, that people of her rank need to be mindful of interduchy relations, and not just internals like a med noble. Yeah, totally different than Det Lind. But Raimund asks the hard question. Does Rosmine visiting mean that he'll have to quit being her disciple? His experience with the dorm supervisor is Frau Larm. She's easily swayed by their home duchy, so he assumes the same for Hersher. However, that's the beauty of it. Hersher's self-funded. She doesn't give a shit what Ehrenfest has to say. That puts him at ease, until a few days later when Brunhilde delivers the news that Ferdinand wishes to speak to Hersher over dinner that night. You know how Hersher never being in the dorm annoys those there when they need her? Yeah, after seeing how Brunhilde talks to Hersher, Raimund gets why she doesn't want to be there either. No one respects her at all. And let's be objective here, that's both parties' fault. So are they gonna make her stop teaching Raimund? She's not planning on it, but that doesn't stop him from worrying. I mean, why is Ehrenfest so hostile towards Arnsbach when Georgine is their first wife? Also, didn't they just marry two brides into that duchy? There were complaints from Arnsbach that Georgine was sending a lot of support back home when Ehrenfest was lower ranked, but he hasn't heard anything that would cause this tension. The next day, he raced to the lab and found the tools cleared out, making him think that he was being ousted. But Hersher clears that up with zero ceremony. He's her disciple. But also, how would Raimund feel about Ferdinand being his mentor as well? Wait, what? Yeah, it turns out Rosmine vouched for Raimund to Ferdinand, and that floors the kid. He assumed that Rosmine was out to get him, but turns out she was in his corner all along. Now he's thankful. All that's left is to pass Ferdinand's test, and he's in. so he throws himself into it. This was a pretty important short story for showing us the other side of the Arnsbach conflict. But from someone so out of the loop, it's honestly comical. Understand, Raimund is a nobody in Arnsbach, so him not realizing why their duchies are on bad terms and assuming his apprenticeship is a battle between Rosamund and Det Lind over some petty disagreement paints how lower-ranking nobles view the upper crust of noble society. And this is the shit I love in these books, because it adds so much more color to the world. Not every noble's gonna be on the same page, even if they're from the same duchy. Next is winter preparations and a traveling merchant's request from Otto's perspective. Taking place in Part 4, Volume 7, this is a story that's showing how far our characters have come from the start, especially as they return to places they used to visit. We pick up where Otto is heading out after dressing down a ton to go to the bar that he and Gunther used to hit up after work. He's meeting a traveling merchant he used to know from back in the day, so there's no need for him to dress fancy. We get some comments from Otto about how his situation has changed, and the friend that he's meeting is the guy who actually told his parents that he married Karina in Ehrenfest. So he owes the guy a lot, apparently. And after those two chat about how much the city has changed, this is after the remodel and all, he gets down to it. Dude wants a hairpin to give a village chief's daughter who took care of him last winter. Problem is, this is after all of the major store owners from out of the city came through, so they're pretty much cleaned out on stock. But after mulling it over a bit, Effa comes to mind, as she does have experience making them. Thing is, a village chief's daughter would be equivalent to somebody like Frida in Ehrenfest City proper, so this needs to be of decently high quality. Yeah, a practice hairpin from an apprentice won't do. So after negotiating the price, he calls Tully over the next day to ask if Effa's available. And Tully says she is, but there will be a fee involved. Yeah, not money. She actually wants some high quality thread for overwinter, and specifically, a large assortment of it. That throws Otto off. Tully never bargains. Look, she's Mine's big sister. Her pattern recognition skills are off the charts, so she knows that some big order is gonna come down this winter. She's just trying to get ahead of the storm, so they're not caught with their pants down like with Anastasius' order. And you know what? That logic holds up. So Otto agrees. I mean, it's not like the thread is gonna go to waste even without an order, but while they're out buying the thread, they spot Benno and Karin. The two seem to be on good terms, but Otto's of the mind that he should settle down and marry her, as they seem to get along well enough. Tully protests, saying Karin is much too young for Benno, as she's about the same age as her. Otto can't quite place why Karin seems so mature, and assumes it must just be because she's 16, and he doesn't see Tully that way because he and Benno have known her since she was a kid. Kinda rude, but I guess it doesn't matter. Benno won't marry her because he's still in love. Wait, Benno loves someone? That's news to Tully. So Otto goes ahead and tells her about Liz, Benno's first love who died to the devouring. After they get the hairpin to Otto's friend, Benno storms in to scold him for giving special treatment to someone outside the city, especially since their store is under so much scrutiny right now. Literally, since they're so low on stock, they're turning customers away. Also, big kinda caveat, don't reach out to Tully's family through her. Yeah, better safe than sorry to broadcast who she's related to. Otto just blows him off and redirects the subject to Benno and Karin, and says he should be nicer to her considering her situation. And while Benno does get what Otto's saying, he's not going to compromise and marry her out of sympathy when it would put his business at risk. Well, can't they just rely on Rosamund's support? No, because Benno actually recognizes how tenuous her status really is. As far as Benno's concerned, he'd just get rid of Karin before marrying her, but after cooling down a bit, he realizes Karin hasn't done anything wrong yet, so he should actually ease up. And with that, they talk about Tully's prediction for winter. This was another fun side story of seeing what the lower city was up to while Rosamund was in the academy, and also a bit of how that Karin plot was unfolding. But while it's interesting seeing what's going on between her and Benno, the real interesting tidbit here was Tully's reaction to their relationship. Yeah, she quickly dismissed it. So what's that mean? Well, we'll see about that over the course of this book. But her and Otto's growth as merchants is made for an interesting story, and we see that Otto still makes mistakes, despite all of his experience at this point. Next is completing the story of Fernestein from Florencia's perspective. This takes place after Volume 8 when Ferdinand's engagement was set in stone. Elvira is devastated, and Rosamund's prompting causes her to write a gender-swapped happy ending for Ferdinand in fiction, as a bit of emotional relief, which leads to Florencia watching over them so they don't get too carried away. Good luck. After the royal decree came down, Florencia was dealing with a whirlwind of crap. Sylvester was refusing a second wife, and Elvira was inconsolable as her muse is being taken away from the duchy. That matters because Elvira is Florencia's closest confidant, so she turns to Rosamund for advice at a tea party, while Elvira and her friends talk about how to convince Sylvester to change his mind for the future of the duchy. Oh, they're on the whole marriage thing, not Rosamund. She took that question in a different direction and proposes they write a story to give Ferdinand happiness in fiction at least. Well, Elvira is sold, but hell if Florencia isn't now stuck trying to keep her friends reined in. Reason being, their criticisms of the royal family might be a bit too honest in this book. And also, they don't want Ferdinand's identity to be so apparent. That would just be the Harspiel concert all over again. Funny how that keeps coming up in these short story collections. So what's the plan? Maybe they could tweak the order to come from an ob. But the current political climate isn't doing them any favors on that front. Firstly, a man being ordered to marry out of a duchy is rare enough already, so that would give Ferdinand's identity away at a casual glance. Plus, you know, Sylvester wouldn't look good with that change. Someone then proposes a gender swap, and Elvira jumps right on that. Now Florencia is the one confused. Wouldn't that make the story not about Ferdinand at this point? Apparently not, because the women there are all in a tizzy over their newfound direction. By taking some inspiration from Anastasius and Eglantine, they can obscure this even more. And that's how they settle on the name Fernestein, an apparent mix between Eglantine and Ferdinand's names. After passing it off to Bertilda to get printed in Haldensel, Rosamund gets a finished copy just before heading off to the academy, and immediately notices it's about a gender-swapped Ferdinand. However, only she and Sylvester caught the similarities due to their closeness to the situation. And that's where Elvira's clever use of the pure imagination clause avoids any possible implications. Of the side stories in this volume, this is definitely among the weakest in my opinion. Like, it's fine, but for what it adds to the overall story, it's not really worth including. And that only stands out because so many others in these short story collections expand on scenes that definitely happened and impacted the main story, but we just didn't get to see them firsthand. Here, it just sort of shows the brainstorming session for Fernestein, and like, that's not super important, especially considering how little it matters in the grand scheme of the series. Next is self-awareness amid everything from Tully's perspective, taking place again in Part 4, Volume 8. This shows Tully's reaction to Benno and Karin's relationship as she leaves Ehrenfest, and what marriage means in the lower city. She's chatting around a fire with some of her co-workers, and turns out her prediction was spot on about needing the thread for Sigiswald's hairpin for Adolfina. But they'll make it in time, so it's not that big of a deal. What about next year though? Yeah, everyone's starting to see the pattern at this point, not just Tully. But next winter, she won't actually be at the Gilberta Company because she'll need to stay home to work on her coming-of-age dress. She obviously wants it to be perfect, since she works for the premier clothing maker in the duchy. However, one of her co-workers is a bit older, and due to that, is actually able to visit the noble quarter. Tully's for some reason worried about losing her spot as Rosamund's personal hairpin craftswoman. But yeah, I think it was touched on in the main story that if Tully's work is ever not up to par, somebody else would step up and Tully would have to pass their work off as hers. That way she wouldn't offend Rosamund. That's hurtful, but I mean, at this point, probably not gonna happen. The topic then shifts to marriage for her and another one of her co-workers who's about her age named Ganilla. They don't want to lose both of them to marriage anytime soon, because you know, they would need a season off to make their home and also probably have a kid. But that's definitely not happening anytime soon, for either of them. I mean, Tully isn't even seeing anyone, but then they start gossiping over Karin and Benno, as they feel they should do something if the two of them are getting married. I mean, he did used to be the owner of the Gilberta Company, right? Tully freezes at the mention of Benno marrying Karin, and interjects that Lutz said that wouldn't be happening. Yeah, she's kind of lost interest as the topic keeps bouncing around, because she's too stuck on what Lutz said, that Benno wouldn't marry some rando from Klausenberg. After the hairpin is done, they get word about a meeting with the High Priest, and that makes Tully nervous, as her main memories of him are from the contract signing. So she asks Lutz to tell her what was discussed when he comes back, and he does, just in time for both of them to head home. She gets teased about Lutz being her boyfriend on the way out, but that's not the case. On the way back though, they spot Benno and Karin, where Lutz calls out. Karin asks who Tully is, and Lutz introduces her as a friend that he's known since they were kids. That makes Karin tease him, thinking they're dating, but Tuli's pretty pissed off about the teasing from earlier on top of this, and also seeing Karin so chummy with Benno, so she asserts that they are just friends, which Karin laughs off. So what are they doing out? Getting spring clothes? Karin's also a bit clumsy in snow apparently? That's kinda weird, right? Isn't Klausenberg farther north than Holdenzell? Surely they get a ton of snow there. Oh, they do, but the people there found a nice solution to not deal with it by just moving all their cities underground. Cool bit of world building there. Anyway, they part after that, where Lutz is just happy that Tuli didn't reveal where she worked. Hairpins are a hot item, and they're trying to hide as many details from Karin as possible. And here was Tuli, getting frustrated that Karin made her and Lutz out to be a couple in front of Benno. They then chat about what was discussed at the temple in that meeting, and Tuli notices that Lutz has a different opinion of the high priest than her. But when the topic of Benno and Karin's marriage came up with the nobles, the dude in question pushed for Karin's father to be punished at the Archduke conference, in a loud declaration that he wouldn't marry her. Tuli thinks that's just the best news ever, so pretty clear now. And Lutz asks her if she has feelings for Benno or something, but she denies it. Yeah, Tuli hasn't even realized the fact herself. After the Archduke conference, we learned that Gustav was apparently trying to force Benno's marriage here, but he used Rosamine and Ferdinand's authority to refuse, going above Gustav's head and causing an argument. So, great news for Tuli. Benno must not have wanted to marry her. As for Karin, well, her father lost his spot. They need to negotiate to get her safe passage home at the end of the season. But sure enough, they get that done. Everyone gathers on the day they're due to depart after summer, and Tuli catches Karin's farewell to Benno. She says she enjoyed her time in Ehrenfest, and she still hasn't forgiven her father for leaving her there. Even Tuli has to admit she might not like Karin, but she's got a strong will and positive outlook despite all the fate is thrown at her. Benno responds saying not to forgive her father, and fight back as much as possible. Tuli's looking at this and sees he's got a ton of kindness in his eyes, and it's clear he doesn't want Karin to leave. That practically breaks Tuli's heart, realizing Benno does have special feelings for Karin. After the merchants leave, Benno notices Tuli and gives her his usual casual greeting, and that just makes it hurt all over again. When he pats her on the head, she says don't treat her like a kid, and he apologizes, but clearly doesn't think too much of it. Yeah, Benno only views her as a child, akin to like a niece maybe, and that hurts. That's when Tuli realizes that her first crush was on Benno, and she kinda feels like an idiot, because Lutz noticed long before she did. So this story explores Tuli's first love with a really unexpected person. That was out of left field when I first saw this. Like, what the hell is up with these sisters and older men? I swear. Joking aside, Benno was a crush and didn't even know Tuli had feelings for him. But my real question was, when did she spend enough time around Benno to even develop these feelings? Was it when he still owned the Gilberta Company? Anyway, while strange choice in partner, this is a story about growth for Tuli as she deals with heartbreak and realizing what maturing actually means. This is an excellent coming-of-age story, and it does so while exploring Tuli's relationships personally, and even sides of her and Benno that we haven't seen before. Next is soldiers and knights gathering intel from Gunther's perspective. This takes place in Part 4, Volume 9 when the priest went missing. It's essentially the information gathering that was glossed over in the main story, since they just headed out to go save the priest after hearing the results from this. Gunther is the North Gate commander at this point, which most soldiers don't want to deal with because it means working side by side with the noble knights stationed there. But something is clearly up, as his subordinate sends word that they've got another noble carriage waiting when they usually just go through the temple. Turns out, the North Gate is mostly for commoners heading to the noble quarter on business, not for actual nobles. This is causing a backup as it takes ages to clear noble carriages for passage, and they're already in a bad mood because no one was at the temple to let them through. That's weird. But as the line piles up, Gunther offers a knight arguing with a Geeb to go check on the temple for the source of the disturbance. The knight's in a bad mood too and tells him to drop it, while the Geeb tells him to quit slacking and go. The knight glares for a moment before apologizing to the noble. Clearly he's of the higher status. So with an excuse, he goes to check and see if mine's okay. Gunther races off and sees two priests now standing at the gate. They aren't too sure what happened to the previous ones, since they weren't there when they took over guard duty. Well, seems like it's sorted. There's guards there now. And Gunther gives them a heads up about some pissed off nobles heading their way, as he races back to his post. Just as he gets a chance to catch his breath though, he gets word that some knights came by on High Beast looking for him. It's Damiel and Angelica, so he's pretty worried something happened to Rosemine. But Damiel has Angelica activate Stenluke to give him the lowdown. He then ends it by saying that Rosemine has high hopes for Gunther, that he can mobilize the lower city to gather eyewitness testimony to give them some leads on where the missing priests were taken. So he tells them about the backed up noble carriages around Fourth Bell, but none were suspicious. As for any other carriages, they would need to contact the other gates for that. Damiel says they'll take it from there because high beasts can travel much faster than a soldier just running. And besides, Stenluke can give Damiel's explanation of the events, so even Angelica can't screw this up. But Gunther wishes to go along too, so the soldiers cooperate easier. While Damiel and Angelica do go along for spring prayer and such, there's not a ton of soldiers that actually accompany them with that. So most would probably just freak out if two nobles dropped in asking questions. That makes sense. Damiel actually allows Gunther to ride on his high beast to go, which is crazy. They visit the other gates where they inform the commanders to question the people working there and then gather in the central meeting room to give a full report later. But at the south gate, one of the captains speaks up saying he saw a suspicious carriage leaving recently. Angelica is ready to spring into action, but Damiel keeps her in check. They hit up the west gate first, where they learn the same suspicious carriage came in that morning before Third Bell. Yeah, they've got a pretty good picture at this point, so Gunther pushes Damiel and Angelica to head back so they can go catch the carriage. But also, their presence is making the soldiers uncomfortable, and Damiel's clever enough to pick up on that. After they leave, Gunther runs around town gathering more information from merchants and such, before racing off to the temple to give his report. He doesn't get to see Rosemine, but Gil informs him that the priests were saved thanks to his information. On top of that, the rescued priests come forth and thank Gunther for the help. They seriously thought they were gonna die. This was another case where the story here expanded on details we already knew, and even added a bit on how noble and soldier relations pan out when they're forced to work together. The real highlight here is seeing the interactions between Damiel, Angelica, and Gunther as their trust has grown over the course of this series. I mean, Gunther has trusted Damiel for a while, but it's here we see how their professional relationship has developed as well. Damiel sees the value in allowing Gunther to be their connection to the lower city, and even Ferdinand had to admit how useful commoners can be for gathering information from this incident. And I'm just not going to turn down a story centered around Gunther. He's a great character to read from. Next is an aged board and a new letter from Eustace's perspective. This is probably the most out of place story in this volume, because it's not just cut content from between part 4 and 5, it's foreshadowing for a story that's not even been written yet, and who knows, might not even be. Eustace is looking through some magic tool lockboxes that are a stand-in for storing sensitive documents when one doesn't have a hidden room available. He tosses Eckhart an old board in this process that's in his way, and Eckhart remarks how its prediction came true. Yeah, the ink is faded and the wood is aged, but they can still barely make out what it says. That Ferdinand is destined to be engaged to the next Ob Arensbach and leave Ehrenfest, which was a relief at the time they got this. Now, it's in Eustace's handwriting, but he doesn't remember writing it. So, how did it get here? Well, he must have written it when Ferdinand was enrolled in the Royal Academy, specifically during a 3-day event where they did some ingredient hunting with Dunkelfelger, but that's another can of worms, because for that specific trip, they only remember the days after putting together some details about when they left, got back, and stories people told them about it. Other than that, they don't remember at all. Pretty damn weird. Ferdinand did investigate it until he hit a dead end apparently, so there's that. When they did get this note, they all were pretty happy. This was also the reason why Haida Marie proposed Eckhart, so she could follow Ferdinand when he moved to Arensbach. This was around when Veronica's abuse was escalating, his father was on his deathbed, his marriage to a Dunkelfelger Archduke candidate fell through, and other marriage prospects were non-existent. So basically, this seemed like the best news at the time, except it also didn't make much sense. Ob Arensbach was healthier back then. There were 2 male Archduke candidates ahead of the youngest daughter, Letizia's mother of course, and she did attend the academy with Ferdinand, but they never actually met before, so marriage probably wasn't gonna happen. Even after graduation, they still held out hope, but Arensbach made no moves, so they discarded it as fake news at that point. And yet, it turned out to be true at the worst possible time, when Ferdinand was finally starting to like life in Ehrenfest. Rosemine did a lot to raise their rank and quality of life, so that helped. Ferdinand trusts her a ton, which is crazy considering Eckhart had to give his name for that level of trust. And speaking of, apparently Ferdinand tried to pawn mine off on Eckhart as a concubine before he realized her true value. Yeah, it was after their synchronization that he went to Karstead about adopting her. Though had Eustace not been divorced, he would have thrust that onto him instead. Meaning Riarda was almost literally Rosmine's grandmother. Kinda cute. From there, they talk about how much Rosamine has done for Ferdinand, while also commenting on how Ferdinand struggles to understand her motives as a commoner, and him never trusting anyone else at face value. To Eckhart and Eustace, it's clear how much Ferdinand cherishes Rosamine, but they do wonder if Rosamine's gonna be okay too. They conclude she has Hartmut, before spoiling a fairly unsurprising revelation a few books early, one I'm gonna keep hidden for those watching in chronological order. Besides, they're more concerned how Ferdinand's gonna handle her absence. Later, Ferdinand gets a letter from Raimund and Rosamine, both of which have been inspected already. They make Sergius read it, where Eustace instructs him how to write response letters for his lord. Yeah, Ferdinand is too busy to write his own replies. Unless they're just unsure how he would respond, then they just leave space for him to do so. Sergius is just surprised that a very good is the highest praise he gives when Rosamine passes all of her classes on the first day, but he'd better get used to it, because it'll be the same for Letizia. The reason it feels out of place is because this is foreshadowing to a follow-up to the main story, probably hinting at some of the shenanigans we see in the spin-off of Hannelor's 5th year, which, any of details of said spin-offs are massive spoilers for this point in the story, so not gonna get into it. While I do get wanting to set that up early in the main series, it was ultimately relegated to an online exclusive short stories collection until now, just feeling like cut content at this point. But aside from that, what this does is comment and foreshadow Rosamine and Ferdinand's relationship from an outside perspective. We know they're close, but how close do others see them? That's an interesting angle we'd yet to see. Next is Hidden Wrath from Bartold's perspective. This takes place during Part 5, Volume 1, and while the other kids didn't know the full extent of Georgine's plan, Bartold did. So this shows what he's doing in response to Matthias betraying their faction when he gave his name. After Matthias approached Rosamine, the Veronica faction gathered in a room where Cassandra approached her brother. She's worried about their parents, but at least their sister should be fine in the playroom, as Matthias bargained for the kids' safety. She's thankful he saved all them, but Bartold isn't. In fact, he's pretty pissed off Matthias betrayed them, and knows that if Matthias's father is getting arrested, so too are his parents for their connection to Georgine. What's certain is he needs to protect his sister and keep his emotions under control for now. In his room, he tells his attendant about Matthias's betrayal. That hits them both that he not only had the balls, but also kept it from his paranoid father of all people. We find out that Bartold is Matthias's cousin, and he's both jealous and proud of the fact that he managed to greet Georgine over summer, and also promised to give his name when he came of age. He actually looked up to Matthias for not just that, but also the fact he's an honor student, so this hits Bartold extra hard, and he writes it off as dude being ungrateful. His attendant relays they may be too late to do anything about the plan anyway, as it's going to take time to scramble the order and arrest everyone. Georgine could already be acting, or everyone might have escaped in time. Based on the Archduke candidates' reactions, they knew something was amiss, but not the details. Thus, they assumed that Matthias just ruined everything. Georgine would have gotten the foundation before Sylvester knew anything. They wouldn't need to give their names to survive. But aside from that, Bartold can't even openly call Matthias a traitor, as that would out him as a co-conspirator, then he'd just be executed. After discussing a method to contact Arnsbach, they realize their options are limited. Only archducal attendants have brooches to enter and exit the dorm, while Oswald told them that apparently Ferdinand did something to monitor ordinances before leaving. Can they trust Oswald though? Well, he doesn't want their faction eliminated since he's name sworn to Veronica, so he's more of an ally than most. Yeah, they're stuck in the dorm and can't get word out, but that doesn't stop Bartold from still trying. He's the one who manipulated that first year into sneaking a letter out, but Lorenz caught the kid before he had a chance to pass it off. Matthias and Lorenz aren't holding back when scolding him, but Bartold steps up and subtly calls out Matthias as a traitor who doesn't care for his family. When the first report of the purge arrives, it's time for the pitch meeting about name swearing where Oswald, Natalie, and Roderick stand in for their charges. Cassandra asks who Bartold is going to give his name to, and obviously it's Wilfried. Sylvester's out of the question for being Georgine's enemy, and Rosamine was never an option. But Cassandra's looking for advice, and he pushes her into serving Charlotte, as she'll have more opportunities outside the duchy. Also, while he does give Rosamine a pretty fair assessment as a lady, saying she would probably treat Cassandra well, she's also sickly, and Bartold doesn't trust she'd not die taking his sister with her. And that right there is about all it takes to dissuade most from serving Rosamine. Sadly, That's just the truth. Not that they know she's more healthy at this point. After the meeting, Oswald stops Bartold to commend him for propping up Wilfrid over Rosemine, and gives him his role, attain a high status, and become a foundation of the administrative state to secure Wilfrid's position. He's trying to keep Florencia out of Wilfrid's education, while providing a biased view that she's just power hungry. He also says they're trying to just wipe out the Veronica faction, and the Archducal family is siding entirely with the Lies gangs. Which, seeing some parallels to Georgine's upbringing, Bartold is on board with Sylvester not making for a good ob now. But he's also not siding with Oswald, at least not internally. No, dude just took a black pill, and he's going Joker mode on Ehrenfest from the inside. So he kneels and asks for Oswald's guidance while keeping his true feelings hidden. Bartold's a little shit and you should hate him. But after reading this, the majority of his motivation didn't really translate into the full story. Like, we knew he was pretty much just trying to stir shit, but here we see exactly why. He bought Georgine's hype and was down to burn the whole duchy to the ground despite swearing his name, which tells us he's basically accepted his death at the start of part 5. Dude is just trying to take down as many people as he can with him. Good thing this mostly just amounts to minor annoyances and petulant bitching throughout the story. Next is sneaking suspicion from Loyalitat's perspective. This takes place in Part 5, Volume 2, following the Sovereign Knights Order's vice commander as he proves he's probably the most rational person in the entire series. That's a rare insight. He's doing some paperwork in the palace when some knights return with a report on the academy. Nothing seems amiss for the upcoming Interduchy tournament, so all is good. Normally, the sovereignty is pretty dead during winter, as most nobles return to their home duchies to gather intelligence and see their families. But the knights weren't allowed to do so this year due to the heightened security. Another slip-up like last year could cause further harm to the already shaky image of the Zent. As for word from the royals at the academy, none yet. Why would they get some? Well, because messages from duchies to the royals go through the Knights Order first. Ehrenfest and Dunkelfelger are doing joint research. They've been summoned to the royals' villas a ton lately, and this fact is annoying the knights giving their report. As they badmouth Rosemine, Loyalitat chastises them as she's been a huge help with those mana donations. However, they clap back that Raublut believes that Ferdinand is pulling her strings. And her shield is much too dangerous, I guess. That incident got a solid chunk of the order to view her as suspicious when it was only Raublut previously. Loyalitat doesn't fall for it though, since he recognizes her goodwill and willingness to help the whole country with this research. Pushing Ehrenfest away now would only harm the royal family in the long run. And it does go further, because her performing Sigiswald's Starbind is causing some issues. Mostly, Loyalitat just feels bad she's getting wrapped up in their politics, when Anastasius should have just accepted becoming the next Zent when he married Eglantine. Though a tidbit does come up, that while the rest of the order was ignorant to Rosemine's shield, Raublut was apparently familiar with it. Weird. How's that? It wasn't a common spell before the Civil War. Loyalitat's old enough to know that. Well, honestly, no one really knows. Raublut's origins are a bit of a mystery, since so much documentation was lost because of the war. They just assumed that the Zent's wife had him in her service, so when Traurqual became Zent, she put him forward. Well, one of them knows that he served a branch royal princess, but whether she married down in status, he was relieved of duty upon her passing, or was forced to resign after he fell in love with her, is among the wild speculations. That's when an ordinance comes from Raublut, requesting Loyalitat come to his office. This is where Rosemine contacted Hildebrand to enter the underground archive, and Raublut launches into some conspiracy postings saying she's changing her point of contact to suit her needs. Loyalitat doesn't think it's that suspicious. I mean, she's still openly contacting a royal, right? Being skeptical is good, but this is just straight up paranoia. Raublut seems to concede and just tells him to stay on guard. The next day, Hildebrand requests the Order's aid in the academy, which puts them in a bind. See, they can't answer that call because they only move for the Zent, and Hildebrand also didn't give them a reason to. But hey, Arthur follows up, saying to ignore that because the prince was overreacting, and he needs to learn that very lesson. So Raublut takes Loyalitat to Hildebrand's villa to explain why they're not responding to his royal orders in person. On the way to the teleporter, Raublut laments not sending Loyalitat along with Hildebrand to keep an eye on Rosemine. He didn't go himself because he so obviously suspects her of doing something, and that would just put her on edge. Besides, she's already wary of him due to Ferdinand's engagement, but that doesn't make sense either. As far as Loyalitat can tell, her mentor wanted that engagement, and it was the tyrannical Ob Ehrenfest who was against it. Raublut then strokes his scar and vague post about Hildebrand, Ehrenfest, and Dunkelfelger may be conspiring to take the throne, but Loyalitat again believes that Raublut is overthinking it. At the villa, they get the full story about Rosmine's engagement being on the line. Loyalitat shows he's a smart cookie once again, by suspecting this might be bride-taking Ditter of all things. He's not personally familiar with it, because he's from Howletza, not Dunkelfelger, but surely Hildebrand's mother could explain it better. From there, he goes on to praise the prince for taking his duty so seriously, but reminds him not to show favoritism for the people he likes. The kid needs to learn what he can and can't do as a royal. Come the Ditter match itself, they get word from Raufin saying Sovereign Knights are leading students into attacking. Luckily, they just so happen to be in the Zent's office, and Raublut responds that they're not under orders to do so. Loyalitat wonders if Hildebrand is behind this, but keeps that to himself as they race off to go capture the knights and interrogate them. When they get them subdued, it's time for some questions, and they're stuck just repeating themselves saying they did what the royal family wants. Great, so they go ask Hildebrand, and it turns out he wasn't even aware the match was that day, so it wasn't him. Hell, after what they said, his mother even told him not to interfere. In the office after that, Loyalitat is struggling to piece this mystery together while Raublut throws every excuse out there to get him off track. He eventually believes a third party wished to frame Hildebrand, and Raublut finally says that Loyalitat is smarter than he thought. But one thing's still bugging him. He's trying to figure out why someone wants to drive a wedge between the royals. But also, who could have known all these details about the date of the match, Hildebrand's situation, and pretty much everything else? Just as the dots start to connect, Raublut asks if he's finished his report, and just like that, he's lost his train of thought, right as the wood in the fireplace behind them crackles, as Raublut threw some more in. We've seen some short stories I thought were fairly unimportant, but this one's the exact opposite, to the point it's arguably too important to omit, and probably should have been included in the main series. Though I definitely would have shifted when to include it, definitely not in Part 5 Volume 2. Like, it gives away a lot of the mystery I enjoyed in Part 5 about Raublut's role in the story. But he's unambiguously manipulative here, and is even trying multiple tactics to do so. And with the insights we get from later on, it gets to be even more diabolical. So, really masterful storytelling that probably should have been included in like Volume 8 side stories. Hell, maybe even could have pushed it back to Volume 9. Next is various goals from Anastasius' perspective. This takes place in Part 5, Volume 3 in the aftermath of Detlin's whirl, but before Eglantine talked to Ferdinand and Rosmine. Lunch after the dedication whirl was pretty tense, as Traurqual's wives try to downplay the event and criticize Detlind. Anastasius agrees entirely. Sigiswald pipes up to switch the criticism over to Ferdinand, as he didn't try to stop her, or at least change her hairpins. Unfortunately for him, Adolfina is there and pointedly remarks that maybe Ferdinand didn't design them, which is extra biting since Sigiswald didn't design the one he gifted her. No, he made her do all the work, which even Anastasius thinks is disrespectful. Not that he would confront his brother about it. That sparks a debate between Sigiswald's wife and wife-to-be, but Eglantine ends it by saying Detlind chose to wear it that way against all advice. Anastasius decides to help Rosmine and Ehrenfest's image here, and sympathizes with Ferdinand for being forced to marry Detlind after all the shame she just brought upon herself. But that's straddling a line by criticizing his father for forcing that with a royal decree. Well, time to change the subject. Wasn't that magic circle interesting? Yeah, Traurqual didn't recognize it, and neither did his scholars. But he knows it must be important. That's when they get word from the Sovereign Temple requesting a meeting. They have information on the circle, and wish to inform the Zent before the public. They're not on good terms, obviously, and it's only gotten worse since the Bible inspection due to the High Bishop feeling slighted by Rosmine. On the flip side of that, Emmanuel is practically obsessed with her and wishes for her to join the temple. Religion declined to help the dedication ritual at the academy, but Emmanuel went behind his back and lent the divine instruments to carry favor with Rosmine. So their power struggle is becoming pretty apparent. All that said, Traurqual will go hear them out, despite everyone opposing the idea. First, it's lunch. He doesn't need to interrupt his schedule for mere priests, but also him going to them? Isn't that kinda below his station? He's supposed to be the king, right? But his wives would probably straight up kill the priest if they came to the dining room. They're forbidden from even going to those meetings. As the last time, they barely contained their anger over how the temple talked to Traurqual. So Traurqual, Sigiswald, and Anastasius go to the meeting room with Religion and Emmanuel, who are smug as hell. Religion starts on a grand speech about the miracle they witnessed, but Emmanuel doesn't seem to give a shit for the theatrics, and cuts him off by stating it was a magic circle for selecting the next Zent. Traurqual asks him to continue, ignoring the High Bishop entirely, where he proceeds to insult Traurqual to his face. His ignorance and the fact he can't make the circle appear proves he's not qualified, and the temple suspects that Det Lind will obtain the Gurcher to formally succeed Traurqual as the next Zent. Yeah, now we see why the wives aren't allowed to attend these meetings with the temple. Talk about raising tensions. But Traurqual makes everyone settle down before it turns into a bloodbath, saying they should celebrate someone obtaining the book. That's a surprise. He'd relinquish the throne to Det Lind? Yeah, if she gets the book, that is. Just don't tell anyone until that comes to pass, because that would probably restart the civil war. Anastasius is watching his brother through this because the dude's obsessed with being Zent. Remember, that's why he was courting Eglantine in the first place. And outside, Sigiswald immediately starts on that they should get the book over Det Lind because they're the ones who kept the country alive. Also, Det Lind's an idiot. That last one's true. Enter Raublut to throw more suspicion on Ferdinand, stating he may have turned his focus to Det Lind since he lost his puppet in Rosemine. Sigiswald latches onto that, though Anastasius sees it as a massive leap in logic. He argues that Raublut is framing it to look suspicious, but no one's actually listening. Traurqual again reiterates that it doesn't matter who gets the book, just that they get one because the country can't last without it. Anastasius notices that that's a complete 180 from the last Archduke conference, when his father sent Ferdinand away so he couldn't get the Gurcher, but he elaborates that the situation has changed. Ferdinand will now be married to a Greater Duchy's Archduke candidate. He can then support her as the next Zent, while leaving Letizia and Hildebrand to run Arnsbach. But key problem, no one wants that. Not Ferdinand, the retainers, or Sigiswald. But this is all a long shot anyway. They would need to find the book first, and all of Traurqual's brothers failed doing so. The only lead out there is that magic circle, and it's pretty much anyone's guess who could get the Gurcher at this point. I mean, who's to say the High Bishop's testimony is even reliable here? Actually, good point. So they summon Rosemine since she's a High Bishop who can read more of the Bible than the Sovereign Temple, while Traurqual takes his scholars to the stage to see if there was any foul play involved. So with him gone, Sigiswald finally asks Anastasius what he thinks of the theory that this is all a plot by Ferdinand. Yeah, not likely. This is right after he talked to Ehrenfest at the Interduchy tournament, and they seem to have their hands full with their own internal politics. Plus, they're not even on good terms with the losing duchies. But Sigiswald believes that Raublut knows more about things than they do, since he was in the meeting where the royal decree came down. There's gotta be a reason he's so suspicious of Ferdinand. Maybe they'd just better eliminate him before he causes problems instead. But that's when Sigiswald recalls that Raublut asked for a key to a certain villa as part of his investigation into Ferdinand. Well, I guess he's off the topic of killing Ferdinand for now. Let's just be happy about that. Whenever the royal family's involved, you can expect there to be a nightmarish amount of lore and politics cropping up, as every page has layers of meaning and details that interconnect to just about every part of the series. And this was no exception here. Seeing the interplay between the royals and Temple, how bad their relationship really is, what the royals were thinking about Det Lind, and even hints about what Raublut is up to set the stage for the final act of the story while still in the first quarter of Part 5. So again, this is a side story I would have loved to have seen included, and one that doesn't completely destroy the mystery in Part 5. So, probably a better inclusion overall. Next is Tully's worries from Lutz's perspective. Taking place in Part 5, Volume 4, Ralph's coming of age is around the corner, and Tully is worried that he might recognize Mine on stage. After the snow melts, Benno calls Lutz to his office where he asks him to go to the Gilberta Company because Tully brought something to Otto and Karina's attention. Sounds important. So he heads on over. Now Benno's not joining him because he's busy doing the pre-trip planning for Kernberger. When he arrives, he uses the side stairs. That's a bit nostalgic because he used to live on the 6th floor of this building, but he's also gotten pretty comfortable with his current setup, being a Laherald living on the 2nd floor of the planting company. Yeah, who would want to drag water up 6 stories, huh? Inside, Otto's a bit disappointed Benno didn't come too, as he wanted his thoughts on this matter, but oh well. Thus, he has Tully do the explaining after a quick venue change for some more privacy. Tully pours tea first, where Lutz realizes his hands are now much bigger than hers. He's also noticing just how far Tully's come in terms of etiquette. Her skin is now much paler since she doesn't have to venture outside as often, and her hands lack the calluses most lower class people have too. Yeah, she's really moved up in the world. But all of his staring is making Tully self-conscious. Anyway, they get into it. Over winter, when she was making her coming-of-age dress and hairpin, the topic of where she should leave from came up. And that's when it hit her that Ralph's coming of age is at the end of spring. Mine would be the one to perform that ceremony, so what happens if he recognizes her, huh? Oto doesn't think it's a problem because who the hell would remember someone you haven't seen in years? But Lutz and Tuli can both comfortably remember everyone from their neighborhood. What about those who have died though? Yeah, even them. But Oto rightly points out that they remember them as they were, not what they would look like years later. You wouldn't assume their death was a hoax if you saw someone who sort of looked like them, right? Yeah, one problem though, mine hasn't really changed much. Her lack of growth has kind of been a point of comedy for a while, but that might actually work to their benefit. People would expect mine to look like she's on the cusp of coming of age, not like Rosemine currently. Plus, her mannerisms and firing off blessings give off a different vibe. If Lutz thinks Ralph might say something about her being a commoner, he'd best nip that in the bud and warn them that they look similar beforehand, or else he might get executed for saying shit about the Archduke's adopted daughter. Tuli asks him to do just that, but Lutz is kinda reluctant. Ralph still has a thing for Tuli, even after all these years, and a new girlfriend. Ralph gives him shit every time he comes home since they work so close together. He doesn't think it's fair, which isn't helped at all by the fact that their parents have basically decided that Lutz and Tuli are gonna get married. He better do this before he leaves on his big trip to Kernberger. So, we're 3 stories into this Tuli's love life saga, and this book has given us a ton of goings on in the lower city. Not just about Tuli, Benno, and Lutz, but also their families who do have some importance to them as characters. But the biggest takeaway here is Lutz being somewhat aware of Tuli as a woman at this point, even if he still sees her as his childhood friend. Their parents are apparently pushing them to get married, but what are his thoughts on that? Honestly, not much. He still thinks about mine a lot, even if it's not in a romantic sense, which sort of puts him and mine as 2 peas in a pod, both with little thoughts on their future partners until it becomes unavoidable. Next is speaking to Lazfam from Rosemine's perspective. Oh shit, she gets a short story in this? That's weird. Yeah, taking place in Part 5, Volume 4, this is just another conversation where Lazfam is asking about Ferdinand's situation in Arnsbach. Lazfam asks Rosemine for a moment to speak to her about Ferdinand before she heads back to the temple. He wants to know why his lord is doing religious ceremonies apparently, and Rosemine actually notices that he's pretty tense. Well, he slips her a sound blocker and tells her that he's name sworn as well. He's supposed to move when things settle down, but he's gotten no information, so he's just looking for anything from Rosemine. She tells him Ferdinand is doing spring prayer, which he'll surely enjoy exploring and gathering during, but both agree it's messed up that they're making him do it in the first place, especially since he's not even married yet. Lazfam does say that he is happy that Ferdinand found an ally in her at the temple of all places, so they chat about how busy Ferdinand has been, and hopefully as soon as he's married, Lazfam will get summoned to Arnsbach to join his lord, but Rosemine is a bit envious of that fact. Yeah, she would never leave Ehrenfest without her family, obviously, but she is a bit jealous that Lazfam will get to reunite with Ferdinand one day, and she won't. So she strikes a deal where Lazfam will tell her stories about Ferdinand messing up in his school days, while she'll include what he wants in her letters. Aside from being short, this one doesn't add much to the story. Barely anything besides showing Rosemine does yearn to join Ferdinand and Arnsbach deep down. But the conversation here breaks the flow of the story when it would have taken place, and it isn't even expanding on much. Like, this is stuff we either already knew or are gonna learn shortly after. What I will say though is it's rare to see Rosemine's perspective out of main chapters, so that's kinda cool. Next is how they've grown from Effa's perspective. This still takes place in Part 5, Volume 4, where Effa gets word she can visit the temple to see Rosemine. Tuli and Lutz come home for a visit to tell Effa the good news. It's rare they're actually home during spring, with Lutz traveling for printing and Tuli Slam preparing hairpins for the visiting merchants. But hey, they managed to slip away for some reason. Gunther will be back kinda soon from work, so they have to wait for him, that way they're not answering the same questions twice. That allows Lutz to go home for a sec, while Effa remarks how nice it is that Tuli came home with her fiancé. That's spoiled a bit earlier than the reveal in the mainline books, so surprise. Except not really. Tuli wasn't aware this was set in stone either. However, Effa confirms it. Both families discussed it already. Lutz is kind of her best bet. She can't exactly marry among her colleagues due to being from a poor family, or in their neighborhood for that matter, because she's moved too far up in social status. Lutz just so happens to be in that same boat. so he's a good catch in that department. As for when they'll get married, the families are willing to work around their busy schedules. This doesn't feel real to Thule yet, but Effa can see there's hesitation there. So does she have someone else in mind? Yeah, but no. More like past tense. She's not over her feelings for Benno, but accepted they were doomed from the start. Engagements are for parents to decide, and she knows Lutz well, so this is fine by her. And you know what? Effa lets her in on a little secret. She felt strange about marrying Gunther back in the day too. Don't tell him that though. He'd probably cry. When Gunther's back, they get down to it. Since Rosemine's grown so much after her second stint in the Jareve, they're gathering her personnel for a wardrobe overhaul. Karina is inviting Effa along to coordinate the dress styles and dyes. Wow, that's huge. Effa actually gets to go to the temple to see Rosemine? Gunther congratulates her because, again, this is huge, even if she can't actually speak to her. But speaking of news, I guess, Lutz has some bad news for Camille. Turns out he can't go to the temple workshop until he's baptized. He cries over that, but Thule scolds him with a pretty strict reminder that if he can't obey an order from a noble, he's nowhere near ready to visit the temple. Camille looks to Effa saying it's not fair she gets to go, and he hates the High Bishop for denying him this chance. Even as Rosemine, she still makes Camille cry. That's cute. Cut to the actual meeting, and Effa gets her first close-up look at Rosemine in ages. She's definitely grown and finally looks like she's about her age, but the main thing Effa notices is just how much healthier she looks. No one would actually suspect she's Effa's daughter now, especially since she acts so much like a noble. But this also makes her realize she needs to buckle down so the summer outfits are done on time. Yeah, this short story drops a hefty bombshell while giving us the cute interactions we're sorely missing from later parts. Lutz and Thule's future marriage is given a pretty solid reason here, and with the earlier stories contextualizing it, we see she's not 100% sold. But ultimately, marriage isn't for love in this world. It's all about stability and growing connections for your family. Lutz and Thule both rocketed up the social ladder to the point their families can't find partners who can actually afford them. But also, their co-workers aren't going to marry these new upstarts. In a way, it kinda mirrors Daniel's issues finding a partner, except these two actually have a chance. Next is engagement circumstances from Thule's perspective, keeping with that whole marriage plot in the same volume. Pretty obvious what this is looking at, so let's get into it. During a break at work, marriage is the topic of conversation as another one of Thule's co-workers is getting hounded by her parents with potential partners. Things are pretty tough, as apparently this girl's father pressured her boyfriend into another engagement because he didn't approve of the guy, showing even in the lower city, marriage is political. Suddenly attention turns to Thule, as they all ask who her dad is forcing on her. But it's not really relevant. The issue is, the closer Thule gets to coming of age, the more creeps come knocking to propose. Yeah, they're not nice either. Most look down on her for coming from the poor end of town, and are only doing so because she makes Rosemine's hairpins. Her coworkers say she should just get engaged to Lutz and put an end to it, but they assume it's because he's younger and that's out of the question, I guess. Most women marry older men because they're established and have savings. Little do they know, that doesn't apply to Lutz. Later, she talks to him about it, and they're still not sure if it's the right move. Lutz was the first to notice her feelings for Benno, and is worried if she's cool with marrying him since she's in love with another man. But as it turns out, since it's set in stone, their parents are forcing it anyway. Lutz has the money to pay for the bride price, because it's one of those societies, despite his young age. And Thule's just not thrilled about marriage in general, but Lutz and her get each other's circumstances and their families get along. The merits outweigh the downside, so she's on board. Also, since he's younger, they still have time before they have to get married. As for her love with Benno, yeah, thinking about it, it would never work out. She would have to be the planting company's matriarch and give up on her work in the Gilberta company to do so. That's not what she wants. What about Lutz? Well, it doesn't bother him that she's in love with Benno, and he could never marry into a merchant girl's family anyway, as he would then have to go work for their store, and he's already contracted to Benno. Plus, he wouldn't anyway. So I guess the question is, when do they want to get married? Well, Thule remembers that earlier talk and thinks moving up their engagement might be for the best. She's not happy to say it, but richer dudes are starting to treat her like a plaything and get forceful. Otto's actually had to step in a few times to chase him off, but the sooner they're officially engaged, the sooner it'll stop. Yeah, good thing Gunther doesn't know. He'd be kicking ass up and down the Central Plaza. And that's not even including what would happen if Rosemine found out. That settles it. Lutz will talk to Otto and everyone else for that matter to get this all squared away before he leaves for Kernberger. And right before Lutz leaves, they head home for the ceremony. and they plan to keep this under wraps so Rosemine doesn't nuke them with a blessing from orbit. Pretty obvious. Carlo rushes the engagement as soon as they enter, and it's a pretty simple process. Camille's stoked to have Lutz as his big brother, but Ralph tries to interject saying he should be his brother instead. We find out here he's gonna go work for the Ingo workshop soon. So, cool. The families will take care of the dowries, but Tully and Lutz have some payments to make to their respective stores as merchants. Apparently marriage is more complicated for them, I guess. Lutz and his family are on one end of the table, while Tully and hers are on the other. There's an empty wine glass where Tide fills it up a third, and then hands it to Gunther to fill up another third with his own wine. The whole while, Gunther is glaring at Lutz because he's an overprotective dad and no one's good enough for his girl, even if he's the one pushing for it, and Lutz fills up the last third of the glass. This is essentially a promise between the two families, where only the men participate, of course. Gunther takes the first swig and then hands it to Lutz with a threat that if he breaks his daughter's heart, he'll regret it. Was that really necessary? Lutz doesn't bat an eye because he's so used to Gunther's antics, and he downs the other half of the wine saying he won't let him down. With that, it turns into a party, with everyone relieved and celebrating, except Ralph and Gunther, the latter saying he still doesn't accept it. The next day, Tully's about to tell her coworker she got engaged, except, they already seem to know. Why is that? Well, as it turns out, she hadn't been wearing Rosemine's charm until Lutz pointed it out that she probably should for protection. So, now she's wearing a bracelet today, which everyone assumes is from Lutz. Alright, that still doesn't explain why. Well, apparently it's all the rage after some rich merchant girl got engaged to a minor noble. Oh, I guess Frida had one last minor impact on this story. Anyway, seems like they didn't need to rush their engagement if all she had to do was start wearing a bracelet. So this is a really good short story that finishes the Tully romance arc that surprisingly carried us through this book. It shows us how she and Lutz came to be a couple, and though they're not in love, they're honestly a perfect match for one another, which also weirdly mirrors a lot of the couples we see later on in this story. In fact, Tully and Lutz's exact dynamic becomes pretty familiar towards the end. But I really enjoyed the simple but symbolic wine mixing ritual, and even that little bit about Frida's quote-unquote engagement. It shows she basically is royalty in the lower city, that whatever she does tends to influence marriage trends among commoners. Yeah, a lot of callbacks, and some solid storytelling here that I'm a fan of. And lastly, we have my first spring prayer from Letizia's perspective. This still takes place in Part 5, Volume 4, but focuses on a thoroughbred noble's reaction to participating in religious ceremonies. Sergius drops in to inform Letizia and her retainers that she's been drafted for spring prayer. That's outrageous to Roswitha, her head attendant. This is supposed to be the duty of the temple, not an Archduke candidate. Sergius isn't that surprised she's upset though. He's delivering this news because he's both Ferdinand's retainer and Roswitha's son. But he goes on to explain Ferdinand's reasoning here, that Letizia would be safer with him on spring prayer as Detlind intends to force her to replenish the foundation. Yeah, now Letizia gets it. Ehrenfest candidates are doing replenishment and religious ceremonies after their baptisms, so Detlind is copying the idea. However, Ferdinand knows that they dedicate mana with the support of their guardians and face stones. Detlind and Georgine probably can't and won't provide that. Since Ferdinand can't enter the replenishment hall due to not being married yet, he's worried they'd overexert Letizia, probably intentionally, which is why he wants her to go along for some practice using face stones first. Makes sense. Besides, Ferdinand is being forced on this trip himself. That's news to everyone. They were told he volunteered. All that said though, he can't force Letizia to join him, and leaves the decision to her. Letizia glances over at the stuffed shoe mill that Ferdinand and Rosemine prepared, with words of encouragement from her parents and Rosemine herself. It's clear they both care about her very much. So Letizia says she'll go on spring prayer as she assumes that Ferdinand has her best interests in mind. Cut to their trip where Detlind instructed them to wear formal clothes, so their deeds would be attributed to the archducal family and not the temple. Though Ferdinand is keen to note, this is just Detlind saving face, so it doesn't appear that she sent them to the temple. But Sergius does pass along that they should wear clothes they wouldn't mind getting dirty in the farming towns. That sounds crazy. They should probably wear their best in front of their citizens. Right? Well, they regret that quickly. She got her formal clothes muddy on the dirt roads. That sucks. The nobles who witnessed the ritual were all impressed at the beauty, because they'd never witnessed one up close. After they rest for the night, Letizia and Ferdinand chat about the trip so far. Everything there is new to her, so she's not sure what's normal outside the castle, or remarks how dirty the farmers seemed. Sadly, those were likely their best and cleanest clothes for the visit. Yeah, Arensbach farmers were worse dressed than Ehrenfest, telling us how dire their situation is. But now that everyone's seen the ritual, Ferdinand asks all the retainers besides the knights to assist starting tomorrow. That's shocking, but he hits back saying he's still an Ehrenfest citizen. Do they all share Detlin's sentiment that he should shoulder their spring prayer? After 2 ceremonies the next day, Roswitha is exhausted, but Ferdinand was fine after doing 4. He downplays it, saying he's just used to the process, but it still impressed Letizia quite a bit. And the next day, it's her turn. He holds her hand over a face stone pressed to the chalice where he repeats the prayer. He's putting his over hers so she can't escape, as he instructs her to push the mana out. And sure enough, as the mana moves inside, she feels some that isn't hers and pushes back against the face stone to keep it away. That's basically what it feels like to use a face stone. Cool bit of lore. When it ends, Letizia's head is spinning, and she nearly passes out, but her knights scoop her up onto a high beast where they leave. Seems collapsing after the first time dedicating mana isn't that uncommon. The next day, they rest to recover because everyone but Ferdinand is drained, and Letizia is given a rejuvenation potion where she realizes just how much she lucked out by going with Ferdinand. Had she stayed, Detlind would have made her replenish mana without a face stone, and she likely would have collapsed in the replenishment hall without any help. None of her retainers could actually reach her. Sergius says that if she still hasn't recovered enough mana yet, there's some potions that Ferdinand prepared that she could use too. And these come with a letter from Rosemine stressing they are, in fact, safe to drink, despite how awful they taste and smell. Sergius can vouch that they work wonders, but are absolutely vile. Letizia gives it a taste, and it's just the absolute worst, despite this being the improved flavor version. Yeah, now she gets why Rosemine might be so sickly. So what's Ferdinand doing today? Gathering ingredients with the knights apparently. Goddamn, the man knows no rest, huh? Every night they rest on the trip, they've been going out gathering, and the knights accompanying them told tales of the amazing ingredients they found. Just by pure happenstance, I guess. Though, it's clear to even Letizia that Ferdinand and his group were manipulating the knights to get said rare ingredients. Wait, was he even strategically planning their days of rest for such trips? Suddenly, Letizia feels like one of Ferdinand's pawns, and it's not a pleasant feeling. This isn't the most important short story, but it is one that gives us a lot of fun information we were already privy to. Like, we know Ferdinand already does spring prayer in Arensbach, but seeing it firsthand and getting Letizia's impression on Ferdinand and Rosemine is honestly pretty nice. It gives her thoughts on them a lot more weight for later on in this series, as we see she honestly believes they have her best interest at heart, though she doesn't really know them on a personal level. It's cute, and probably a major factor in Letizia's mindset going forward. I do wish we got more from Letizia in this series, because her relationship with Rosemine and Ferdinand is a highlight. The first short stories collection did a lot to flesh out Noble Society in part 3 for us, but the second one actually turns that on its head. See, we're deeply involved with Noble Society in the back half of part 4 and into part 5, so we really didn't see a lot of that commoner perspective. Also, just nice seeing some needed context for some of the events happening to Rosemine from outside her circle. Loyalitat and Bartholds are honestly a damn shame they were left outside of the mainline story, but I think what surprised me the most was how many were focused on Tully and her doomed romance with Benno. Like, I didn't even know she had a crush on him in the main story, so pretty crazy. You would think these side story collections would be skippable, but that can't be further from the truth, especially if you love this series. So hopefully the third one gets an English translation sometime in the near future. For now though, hey, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with the link down in the description, and if you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon, or hey, I've got channel memberships now too, that way you can pick up some extra perks. Speaking of supporters, I'd like to give a special thanks to Autumn Stott, JMon33A, Pokeflute, Robin DBL, Samuel Chen, Tristan, and Vonstrom for their continued support. Thanks for watching.